Chapter 84 Riley tilde. Do you think it'll help him? Kimberly asked, chewing on her bottom lip. She still stared after him long after he ran into the forest. We were off-screen, and the tears that had started on screen were still coming down her cheeks uninterrupted. Maybe that was why she was a good actress. Because the feelings, to her, were real. Even as we and the mercenaries started preparing for what was certainly going to be a big action scene, she would occasionally glance in that direction or find an excuse to climb up onto the fort's upper wall lookout paths, hoping she might be able to see into the forest. It was too dark to see anything, even under the full moon. I didn't know how to answer her question. It can't hurt, I said. The werewolf curse is strengthened by trauma. The man embraces the wolf to forget the pain. Maybe helping him forget his trauma will help him overcome the wolf. But like I told you, I don't know what will happen, Kimberly. And one's nightmare drop was powerful, but it was also a bit vague. I wished I knew what to say to make her feel better. Heck, I wished I could understand exactly what was going through her mind. This was a storyline, and when it was over, Antoine would be fine, assuming we survived. Was she worried that the damage would be more than just physical? I didn't have time to dwell on that. That wasn't my job. I wasn't there to help Kimberly just then. I wasn't there to help the mercenaries get their guns oiled and laid out. I was a planner. We had already come together and digested Antoine's transformation on screen. There wasn't much to it. We stood around, looking at his blood trail in the moonlight, and realized that we might share his fate within a few days. Kimberly cried. Andrew rationalized. Hawk and Michael planned their hunt. I did nothing but use the little camera from the back of my character's car and film things. It was a great way to contribute without contributing much. The funny thing was, my character would be feeling the same way I was, or close enough. What did I feel? What did I really feel? Like I had just barely escaped death. Like I was a doomed man. No. I felt like we just had to get the scene over with and go back to planning. Feeling things was the enemy. If we worked and planned and manipulated the story just right, all of our feelings would disappear. I hoped. The truth was we were underleveled in this sandbox of a storyline, and Second Blood was likely to shock and awe us into oblivion. We could die here. And one's fate might not be temporary. My fate in this story, probably a tragic one, might not be temporary. As much as we were acting, we weren't really. This was real danger. All I could do was treat it like a game and do whatever it took to win it. If we failed, I wouldn't have to think about it. Andrew and I had plans to make. Unlike previous nights, Kirst had not flown away in a helicopter just yet. Maybe he knew there wasn't going to be another attack tonight, that Antoine's transformation was the only excitement we would get on this full moon. We still had quite a bit of work to do to make rolling silver usable as a weapon. There was no doubt it was effective, but the problem was you had to hold it up against a blowtorch for a minute or two. Then, once the silver had already been cured of its impurities, the effect would fade away. Pure silver wasn't notably more effective than, say, sterling silver. But while it was being purified, something was happening that shredded those wolves in an unseen way. Suffice it to say, it was not battle-ready. In truth, I thought we would be up all night trying to figure this out, but Carousel seemed to know otherwise. The moment we started speaking about it, huddled in the corner of the fort's courtyard not long after Antoine left, we went on screen. We were going to have a busy night. So, we figured out what rolling silver is, Andrew said. We could spend weeks trying to understand it, but we only have until the end of this phase of the lunar cycle to turn this into a viable weapon. Now, I've been thinking up some ideas about how we could create a sort of rig to melt the silver and sift it back and forth so that the impurities would be removed. If only we had a proper engineer around. I thought perhaps a cement mixer and a large blowtorch might do the job, but even then, I am out of the realm of my expertise. Also, werewolves might notice the cement mixer, I said. I wasn't trying to be a smart aleck, but sometimes it just ended up that way. We were in deep thinking, brainstorming mode, The mode that came right after research when we had to put all the facts together. I was pacing back and forth. You had to pace back and forth for a brainstorming montage. We're assuming that it's that particular method that is causing the effect on werewolves, I said. Isn't that what we concluded? Andrew replied. We sought to discover what rolling silver was, and we found it out. Now we have to find a way to apply it to the problem. We discussed it for some time out there under the moonlight. We need something portable, I said. I wouldn't be surprised if they attacked us all at once, but we can't rely on that, not in the time frame we have. We need something we can carry around with us. Something that doesn't need our full attention. Andrew was exasperated. He wasn't sure where to go with that. And what do you propose? He said. I scratched my head, hoping that this line of thought would bear fruit. What if it wasn't the specific method? I said. I've been thinking about this. You're not going to like it. This is a magical curse. We're thinking too scientifically. Maybe it isn't the heat or the silver particles or the gases being released that causes the damage. What if it's the very act of purifying silver that causes the damage? Like it has some magical effect. We weren't alone in our brainstorming montage. We had Hawk Kipling with us. Despite his gruff exterior and ample weaponry, he was technically an academic. Unfortunately, he had nothing to contribute to the conversation. But I did think the way he looked at me was weird. Was that a good sign or a bad sign? I couldn't tell. I assumed he wanted us to win, but I had no idea how much he was willing to do to help us. What is it you're suggesting? Andrew asked. We don't have enough data to speculate on the exact mechanism for this effect, and I would hardly expect it to be so abstract. He was doing great. He was a man of science. I was a semi-psychic grandma's boy. It was a nice back and forth. In modern times, how do we purify silver? I asked. Chemicals, Andrew answered confidently. We use chemistry. Let's try that, I said. We know that rolling silver was the activity used for purifying silver. So what chemicals can we use in place of a giant blowtorch and a frying pan? I really wished we had had time to talk about this off-screen, but we had only shared snippets of ideas. It's that simple, then. We'll just use chemicals to activate the magical reaction, Andrew said. But right after he had finished, I could see an idea appear in his eyes. Well, we could. He said. We could what? I asked. He paused for a moment, thinking. We need to run an experiment, Andrew said. We don't have much time, and I don't know if we could get the equipment we need before sunrise. It will have to be quick and dirty. If we need something that can be portable and done quickly like you say. Where's Kirst? He's back at the manor, I said. It's time we put those unlimited resources to use, Andrew said. Are you sure this will work? Kirst asked. He was sitting in the same dining room where we had had our fateful dinner. No, Andrew answered. This is in the name of experimentation, a much more convenient method for purifying silver. It is our current hypothesis that it is the very act of purification that seems to affect the wolves. As if by magic. Kirst was silent for a time. Can you get our supplies? I asked. Kirst nodded his head. He had no choice. We were his only hope. He looked over to his butler and nodded toward him. Andrew had written up a quick list. The butler took it and was soon out of the manor. If we can get those back before morning light, we should be able to test to see if it is effective. A quick chemical purification of silver would be far preferable to the bulky setup needed for rolling silver, Andrew said. Yes, Kirst said. It is my understanding that Mr. Stone has left a blood trail into the forest. That's right, I said. He stepped on one of Miss Morgan's silver caltropes. The wound isn't going to heal for some time, so they will be able to track him. Hawk Kipling feels certain about it. Will you have this weapon ready in time for the excursion? Kirst asked, his expression intense and concerned. Time was closing in. I cannot make such a promise, Andrew said. If this chemical version works, then yes, we can begin production on a weapon that will bring the werewolves to their knees. I don't know if the mercenaries are willing to wait that long. Kipling has been stoking their fears about the full moon tomorrow night being stronger than tonight's. Remember, you only have to kill the pack leader, Curse said. Just one death is necessary. I suspect we'll get more than one death, whether we like it or not, I said. Curse didn't respond. Good to his word, Curse was able to get us the supplies Andrew had drawn up within an hour and a half. It was good to have a wealthy benefactor. We were in the basement, accompanied by the growling of 2 caged werewolves. Their snarls echoed off the stone walls, though I noted they weren't as energetic as they usually were. It was the first full moon of the cycle. The waxing moon. No. Waning. Waxing. It had something to do with a gibbon? That was all I knew. I wasn't an astronomer. The effects of rolling silver were still evident on Logan and Avery, leaving them in a weakened state. It wasn't clear if this was due to the potency of the process itself or simply because they had no grit to defend against it. The table that had once held a blowtorch was now set up with a variety of laboratory glassware, beakers, flasks, pipettes, and funnels, all glinting under the lantern light. We didn't need most of it, nor had we asked for it, but Carousel often insisted on setting the scene. On screen. Andrew looked nervous as he held up a large glass beaker, inspecting it carefully. "This will do nicely," he said. He placed it on the table and then lifted a plastic jug from beneath it. Another jug sat nearby, which I grabbed to look useful. "Water first," Andrew said sternly, which was an instruction for me because I had the distilled water. He should have called it H2O like a proper movie scientist. Carousel was going to duck points. I poured the water in until it hit the amount he had told me previously. He began to pour a liquid from his jug, narrating as he went, equal parts nitric acid. The clear, slightly yellowish fluid poured gently into the beaker. Andrew reached into a small wooden crate that had once been filled with various silver items that Cursed Man had collected. These had been melted down by Huddy Morgan into small, uneven lumps and pellets. He laid them out on a scale, meticulously measuring until he reached the precise weight he wanted. Satisfied, he used a pair of tongs to drop the silver pellets into the acid-water mixture. It didn't take long to see a reaction. The silver began dissolving almost immediately, tiny bubbles forming as it broke down into the solution. "The silver will dissolve, forming silver nitrate," Andrew explained. "The contaminants will simply sink to the bottom." As he spoke, I watched exactly that happen. The heavier impurities sank in slow motion, settling into a dark sludge at the bottom of the beaker. The reaction was faster than I'd expected, thanks to the small size of the silver pellets. Logan, the werewolf he had become, began to moan softly in his cage. Andrew and I exchanged a glance. That sound was a sign of success, even though we hadn't expected it so early in the process. "Interesting," Andrew said, his brow furrowing. "We've not yet produced pure silver. Simply removing the impurities seems to affect them. Even at this stage, all we have is silver nitrate." When the silver pellets had dissolved entirely, all that remained was a mostly clear liquid with sediment settled at the bottom. "Now we must filter the solution," Andrew said. He poured the mixture through what looked an awful lot like a coffee filter, though its setup was decidedly more scientific. The liquid dripped into another beaker below, leaving the dark sediment behind. Andrew worked with the precision of someone who had clearly paid attention in his college chemistry classes. I, on the other hand, tried not to stick out like a sore thumb while I watched. "Now, the real test," Andrew said. He opened another wooden crate, which was filled with copper items, wires, pipes, and fittings. Selecting a small clump of copper wire, he gripped it with tongs and held it over the filtered silver nitrate solution. "We drop the copper into the silver nitrate, and we should precipitate pure silver," he narrated. Sure enough, as the copper hit the liquid, an instant reaction occurred. A dull clay-like material began forming around the copper wire. "That's silver?" I asked softly, captivated by the transformation. It didn't look like it. The audience would need a dumb guy to ask about it. "Yes," Andrew said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "Silver crystals. He gave the beaker a gentle shake, causing the gray material to fall off the copper wire and sink to the bottom of the beaker. The process repeated itself. New crystals grew, detached, and sank, forming a growing layer of pale material. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought the process looked like mold forming. As the reaction continued, the once clear liquid turned a vibrant, intense Windex blue, a hue I swore Carousel was adding in to make it look cool, but Andrew would later inform me that it was quite accurate. "See?" Andrew said. "The copper displaces the silver in the silver nitrate, forming that brilliant copper nitrate and precipitating pure silver. Of course, we'll need to wash and melt it down to make it usable again, but I'd estimate this silver is already 90 to 95% pure at least." To me, it looked like yogurt and not silver. But looks could be deceiving. A third reaction occurred at the same time as the others, and it wasn't in the beaker. It began the moment the silver started forming on the copper wire. It was in the cages. Logan and Avery, the caged werewolves, howled and screamed. Their thrashing grew weaker until, moments later, both collapsed to the floor of their cells, unconscious. Andrew and I looked at each other, stunned. The reaction itself had somehow incapacitated the werewolves. They were 6 or 7 feet away, yet simply purifying the silver through this chemical process had completely neutralized them. "Huh?" Andrew said under his breath. "None of this makes any sense, but it does seem to confirm our hypothesis." Kirst, who had been watching in silence, leaned forward, his eyes alight with newfound determination. "How much more of these supplies do you need?" he asked. Andrew and I exchanged a glance. "As much as you can get," I said. Chapter 85-1 The forest was endless, but I ran anyway. The trees bent and swayed unnaturally, their shadows clawing at me like they were alive. My paws tore at the ground, but no matter how far I went, the air clung to me, thick and heavy. The wolf snarled in the back of my mind, restless and wild, but I forced it down, forcing myself forward. Forward to where? I didn't know. I had messed up. I had ruined everything. They had talked about shame. Heck, I had talked about a young wolf's shame, and I knew best. It took everything I had not to wring myself into a knot just thinking about my shame. I was cursed. I was a monster. I was broken. It was my fault. "No," the wolf said in my mind. "Just let me take over. It will all blow away. I can run fast. I can run faster than the shame." I fought the urge to just let it win. It felt like I was fighting gravity. Eventually, gravity wins. Always. I still ran. My mind was weary, but my legs were not. The world twisted as I went along. Was I losing my mind, or was it losing me? The trees began to shimmer, their bark sliding into the shape of smooth wooden beams. Hallucinations. Just like old times. The underbrush curled and darkened, becoming carpet underfoot. The scents of dirt and pine dissolved into something sharper, lemon cleaner and old upholstery. A sound broke through the woods, a faint ringing, high-pitched and insistent. My ears twitched toward it. "What is that?" The wolf didn't know. I stopped running. I stopped fighting. I needed to see this. The ringing grew louder, sharper, joined by the flickering of light. Between the trees, shapes began to emerge, solid shapes, angular and familiar. A chair appeared first, then a couch. Beyond it, the static glow of a television flickered. The wolf growled, uneasy, but I pushed it down and stumbled closer. This was the place I went in my mind when I really wanted to hate myself. On screen. No. Not on screen. Don't show the audience this. Don't show. Riley. As I approached, the ringing turned into the unmistakable chime of a phone. A corded house phone. The shape solidified, snapping into place, and there it was, my living room. Not just any living room. My living room. The one I hadn't seen in years, but knew in every detail. The scuffed coffee table my mom had resurfaced, the well-worn leather couch with the cigarette burn in the arm that my dad insisted was there to let the air out of the cushions when you sat down, the little television perched precariously on the old TV stand. It shouldn't have been here. Not in the woods. Not ever again. The air shimmered. There were no walls, no ceiling. The furniture stood alone, surrounded by trees that crept impossibly close, as if the forest were trying to consume the scene but couldn't. The wolf stirred inside me, pacing, growling low and uncertain. This scared him more than silver. The phone rang again. It sat on the coffee table, old and beige, the cord coiled like a snake. My fur bristled as I took another step forward. I had to watch. This was my punishment. The sound of muffled crying broke the tension. My head snapped toward the couch. Two figures were there now. My mother, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. Beside her sat my father, his fist clenched on his knees, his face red and twisted with anger. It's not them. I knew it wasn't. They were NPCs. In the straggler forest, it wasn't like this. There, it was all in my head. Here, Carousel was reenacting my worst memory with NPCs. But I couldn't stop myself from stepping closer, pulled by something deeper than fear. Farther away, I saw the staircase. It shouldn't have been there, it had no place in the middle of the woods, but it rose in the distance, dark and familiar. On the steps, half hidden in shadow, was me. A smaller NPC version of me, 14 years old, hunched down with wide eyes, peering at the adults below. He didn't notice me, or couldn't. The wolf howled inside me, restless. This isn't real. It screamed, but its voice was drowned by the sharp ring of the phone. It is real, you stupid wolf. It is real and everlasting. My mother reached for the phone, her trembling hand lifting the receiver. Her movements were jerky and mechanical. She put it to her ear and, after a few moments, said, "It's Christian." Her voice cracked, thick with tears. She really did sound like my mother. The look wasn't far off either. Christian. The name hit me like a stone, and I stumbled back. The wolf growled, confused, but I couldn't look away. The scene unfolded as if it had been waiting for me. It was my memory of the call. The call that changed everything. The room darkened. The staircase loomed. The figures moved, their voices rising in frantic urgency. The wolf snarled, unsure whether to attack or run, but I couldn't move. The ringing faded, replaced by a thin voice on the other end of the phone. I could hear it coming out of the handset because my ears were oh so large. It was Christian's voice, but it wasn't him. And I knew, this was wrong. But I kept watching. The room tilted as I watched, the edges of the furniture blurring and shifting like shadows underwater. My parents, the knockoff parents, came into focus. My mother sat hunched on the couch, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her sobs broke the air, jagged and raw. My father paced back and forth, his heavy boots thudding on the floor that shouldn't exist, his face red with barely contained fury. His voice rose, sharp and accusing, but I couldn't make out the words. The air rippled, and the room pulsed, like it was breathing. He was in middle management, but he dressed like a bricklayer on his days off, just like my granddad had. Put him on speaker. He barked, the words suddenly clear. My mother obeyed, her hands trembling as she pressed a button. The phone's tinny speaker buzzed, and then I heard it. Christian's voice. My brother's voice. But it wasn't his voice. Not really. It sure fooled us then though. "I'm not coming back," the voice said, hollow and distant. It carried the sound of something else beneath it, something oily and slick that I could almost smell. "I found a new home." The words coiled around my chest, squeezing tight. The wolf stirred, uneasy, but I silenced it. Listen, I thought. Just listen. Why was this on screen? What was Carousel doing? And then I realized. Carousel was going to take my worst memory and cut it up and make it my character's backstory. My character's brother got himself bitten by a wolf. My real brother got trapped by Carousel. The little boy who lost his brother. That was me in every story. "Christian, you don't mean that." My mother cried, her hands clutching at her chest. "Please, come home. We can fix this." "Fix it?" My father snapped, his voice full of venom. Do you know what you're throwing away, boy? All the work we put in. All the sacrifices. You're ruining everything. In the corner, by the stairs, I saw myself, young Antoine, hunched over, trying to make himself smaller. His wide eyes darted between the adults, his fingers digging into the worn carpet. I could see the tension in his jaw and the way he held his breath to avoid making a sound. Across the room, a well-dressed third figure spoke, and as soon as he did, we went off-screen just for his lines. We called him my uncle, but he wasn't. He was Chris' sports agent, and Chris was his meal ticket. Or he would have been if Chris hadn't gotten trapped here. He stood by the television, arms crossed, his voice calm but calculated. "Christian," he said smoothly, "we've already got scouts lined up. They're expecting you. You don't get another chance like this. Come back before you ruin your entire future." "No," Christian said. "You don't get it. I never wanted that future. Not the scouts. Not the games. Not any of it. I've made my decision. I'm not coming back. Not now. Not ever." Back on screen. The room went still. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The wolf clawed at my mind, restless, but I kept it quiet. He didn't like this. If I had to see it, so did he? "You're throwing your life away," my father roared, his voice cracking. "Don't you ever say you never wanted this life. We gave this to you." Christian's voice on the phone didn't waver. It didn't crack. It was cold, unfeeling, the edge of something monstrous in its calmness. "I don't want it. And I don't want to see you again. Any of you." The room pulsed again, darker now, as though the shadows were swallowing it whole. My mother's sobs turned into static. My father's anger dissolved into smoke. My uncle melted into a dark smear. Only the phone remained, the faint hum of the line echoing. And then there was silence. When the room returned, it was empty. Just the old, broken furniture and the faint hum of the television. No adults. No argument. Only young Antoine remained, sitting on the carpet, his small fingers fiddling with the phone. His wide eyes were determined now, focused as he pressed the buttons on the machine. He pressed the buttons for *69. Last call return. My parents didn't know about it or didn't remember. It was a way to dial the number of someone who called you before caller ID. The line clicked, and Christian's voice came through again. But this time, it wasn't an argument. It wasn't shouting. It was quiet. Too quiet. And I couldn't look away. The room was suffocating now, the air thick with something unspoken, unseen. The television's glow flickered weakly, the only light left in the shapeless void. Young Antoine sat cross-legged on the floor, the phone cradled in his lap. His small fingers gripped the receiver tightly as he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Chris?" he asked, his tone trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "I'm here," Christian's voice replied, smooth and steady. But it wasn't Christian. It was never Chris. I had been tricked. The wolf growled inside me, restless. I knew the truth now. It was Carousel, imitating my brother's voice. "I have a game next week," young me said, his voice picking up energy. "You should come. Mom and Dad haven't been going since you left." The line crackled faintly. There was a pause, long enough to feel like a blade about to come down. "I can't," Christian's voice finally said, soft but firm. "I can't do that." Young Antoine's small shoulders slumped, but he didn't give up. "Then, can't I come live with you? Please?" The wolf inside me bristled, pacing, growling. In my mind, I screamed, "No. Don't ask that. Don't say that." But the boy on the floor didn't hear me. He leaned closer to the phone, his hope stubborn and unyielding. "You don't mean that," Christian said, his tone sharper now. There was something dark beneath it, slithering in the pauses. "You don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do," young Antoine said, his voice firm, his little hands clutching the phone like a lifeline. "I hate it here. I want to come with you." A heavy silence followed. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. The room around me flickered again, threatening to dissolve into the shadows, but the phone stayed solid, real. "You're too young," Christian finally said. "Maybe when you're older." Young Antoine's face fell, but he didn't let go of the phone. "Promise me," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "Promise you'll come get me." "Are you sure?" Christian asked, his tone softening as though he cared. As though there was still a piece of my brother somewhere in the voice. But I knew better. "I'm sure," young Antoine said, nodding, though there was no one there to see it. The line hissed softly, and then Christian said, "Okay. When you're older, I'll reach out to you. It is your choice, after all. I love you, buddy." Young Antoine smiled, small and hesitant, and the room began to dissolve. The furniture faded first, turning to ash and smoke that swirled around the boy. The television blinked out, its glow replaced by the cold silver light of the moon. The phone fell from his hands, disappearing before it hit the ground. The boy looked up, his wide eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we stared at each other, man and child, wolf and boy. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. And then he, too, faded into the shadows, leaving me alone in the forest once more. The wolf surged forward, trying to take control again, but I shoved it back, snarling at the emptiness. The forest was still. The air was cold. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, Carousel was laughing. I ran. It was my fault. All of it. I had gotten everyone trapped here. I had asked for it. Then, the voice I had been suppressing for so long spoke to me in the night. "This, too, can be blown away in the wind," the wolf said. I wanted it to be true. I wanted the wolf to eat through the guilt and the shame and the pressure and let me sink down into nothingness. I wanted to look up at the moon from the bottom of the pit and see nothing else, remember nothing else. Could it be possible? There were only bad memories in the straggler forest. But this was a different forest. I could just give in. No one would know. I would be free of it all. But even if freedom came, it would only be for a while. It would only be until we beat the storyline. The wolf would be gone. It couldn't protect me any longer once we got to the end. Victory would be a hard yank on the leash of a running dog. If we won the storyline, even the wolf couldn't save me. If we won. If. Chapter 86-1 The forest shifted again, the shapes of the trees melting into something both unfamiliar and known. The air was full of energy, heavy with memories that weren't mine, or weren't fully mine. I stopped running, my massive chest heaving, and the wolf growled low in confusion. The world around me wasn't the woods anymore. It was something else. I dug my claws into the dirt and put all my attention into what was before me. A payphone stood just ahead, glowing faintly in the moonlight like a beacon. Beside it stood me. Or the slightly younger man I used to be, years older than the one hiding on the stairs. My younger self clutched the receiver tightly, his breath misting in the cold air as he spoke into the phone. Strange. I almost remembered this as if it really happened, but this was all fiction. "Christian?" Younger me asked, his voice hesitant, hopeful. "It's me." The voice on the other end was warm, welcoming, too perfect to be real. "It's good to hear from you, Antoine. I wasn't sure you'd call." Younger me shuffled nervously, glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to be watching. "I didn't know if you'd want me to after all these years." Christian laughed softly, the sound smooth as silk. "Of course I do. You're my brother. I've missed you. Come out to the cabin on the lake I told you about. We can talk in person." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Carousel was recreating how I was lured to Carousel to find my brother, but a version for the storyline. The parallels were eerie. The wolf inside me growled, restless and wary, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as my younger self nodded, his hand tightening around the receiver. "Okay," younger me said. "I'll be there." The scene blurred, the edges of the memory twisting and warping until I was standing outside a cabin deep in the woods. The younger version of me emerged from the shadows, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His movements were careful, deliberate. He didn't trust the place, and neither did the wolf. The cabin was old and weathered, its wooden planks dark with moss. The windows were shattered, the glass glinting in the faint moonlight. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, with the faintest undercurrent of decay. Younger me paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. This was the restricted cabin from Camp Dyer. Carousel was having fun with this. It liked to reuse props. "I'm here," the younger me called, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. "Christian." The silence was deafening. Then, a low growl rumbled through the night. Younger me turned just in time to see the first wolf emerge from the shadows. Its yellow eyes glinted, and its teeth gleamed like daggers. Younger me was ready. He dropped the duffel and unzipped it in one swift motion, pulling out a long, gleaming knife. When the wolf lunged, he was already moving. His blade flashed, slicing through fur and flesh. The wolf yelped and fell, blood staining the dirt. The blade stayed in the wolf. There were more blades where it came from. More wolves came, too. They emerged from the shadows like specters, their growls filling the air. Younger me fought with precision and fury, his movements sharp and calculated. He was prepared for this. This was my character. He had been raised as a monster hunter. He was ready. I watched, my claws digging into the earth as I fought the urge to intervene. The wolf inside me wanted to leap into the fray, to tear into the attackers, but I couldn't. This wasn't real. This wasn't now. It was a memory that had been fabricated for the storyline. I was on screen. One by one, the wolves fell. Younger me stood panting in the center of the clearing, blood dripping from his seventh blade, smoke rising from the barrel of his gun. And then, from the shadows, came the last wolf. It was larger than the others, its fur darker, its eyes brighter. It didn't attack right away. It circled, slow and deliberate, its gaze locked on my younger self. The wolf lunged, and younger me moved on instinct. The knife plunged into its chest, and the wolf let out a pained howl before collapsing to the ground. Younger me staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He dropped the knife, staring at the wolf's lifeless body. He called out for Christine in the darkness, not knowing where his brother was. Not knowing if the wolves had killed him. Hours later, the sun rose. The fur receded from the wolves, and there he was, Christian. His eyes were open, empty, his face blank from death. This wasn't my real brother. They copied me but not him. Strange. Carousel had him. Why not use his body for this sick charade? No, younger me said, his voice breaking. No, no, no. The air around me thickened, the memory collapsing in on itself like smoke pulled into a void. The wolf in my mind laughed, its voice sharp and cruel. You killed your own brother, it said, the words echoing in my skull. No, I didn't. I tried to yell, but all that came out were roars. That was the parallel. My character killed his brother. I killed mine. It was an accident. It was Project Rewind. But I did it. True guilt is deaf to reason. I was always suspicious of people who forgave themselves too easily. I staggered backward, the forest returning around me. The cabin was gone, the payphone was gone, and the blood was gone. But the pain lingered, sharp and unforgiving. I turned and ran, tearing through the trees blindly, as if I could outrun the memory, the wolf, and the weight of what I'd done. I had killed my brother. How could I live with that? I could save him. That was it. That was my one redemption, but it felt so impossible. How could I keep going long enough to rescue him? How? And I had screwed it up. I couldn't help anyone now. Something pulled at me, tugging me forward like a thread sewn into my chest. The wolf didn't fight it, and neither did I. I ran because it was the only thing I could do. The forest thinned, the trees growing sparse and scattered, their shadows no longer deep enough to hide in. There was a river. I jumped over it like it was a crack in the sidewalk. The pull in my chest was stronger now, dragging me forward, relentless and undeniable. The wolf inside me stirred, no longer fighting. It wanted this as much as I did, though neither of us could name what this was. The air shifted. The scent of pine and soil faded, replaced by something else, something sharp and layered. The acrid tang of asphalt, the faint musk of oil, and the unmistakable scent of wolves. My steps slowed as I reached the edge of the forest and saw it. The motel. The diner. The main street of southeastern Carousel. The motel sat squat and unassuming on the side of the road, not too far from the river I had crossed moments earlier, its neon sign flickering weakly. It was familiar. Too familiar. I knew this place. We had been here before the dinner, before the infection. The wolf in me growled softly, its nose twitching. I could feel them now. The wolves. They were everywhere. Their scents clung to the motel like a second skin, seeping into the cracks and shadows. But it wasn't just the motel. The scent carried on the wind, leading to the hills beyond, to the houses tucked into the woods, to the town itself. This was why we couldn't figure out where the wolves were hiding out. They weren't hiding in caves, abandoned buildings, or dens. They were here, living among the humans, blending in. Hiding in plain sight. No. There were so many of them. I took a step forward, my paws crunching softly against the gravel. The wolf strained against me, its instincts surging. It wanted something, someone. Then I heard the voice. Easy now, child. It was soft at first, just a whisper carried by the wind. I froze, my ears twitching, my muscles tensing. Everything is okay now. The voice grew clearer, stronger. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I turned, my eyes locking onto a figure emerging from the shadows. A woman. She moved with the grace of a predator, her bare feet light and deliberate. Her dark hair framed her face, her expression calm but commanding. I knew her. I knew her. Sarah. On the red wallpaper, it said Serena, but this was Sarah, the same woman from Kimberly's photographs. I'd seen her smile, seen her arm slung casually over Kimberly's shoulder, like an older sister or a trusted friend. But as she stepped closer, I felt it. She wasn't just Sarah. She was something more. The wolf in me surged forward, desperate to close the distance. My body moved without thought, my claws digging into the ground as I bounded toward her. There was no fight this time. I didn't hold it back. I couldn't. She was the reason I had run, the reason I was here. She didn't flinch as I stopped in front of her, panting and trembling. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it like a tidal wave crashing over me. She could make the pain go away. Her presence was the wind. It was the moonlight. It was peace. It was freedom. She was overwhelming, her power radiating from her like heat from the sun. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed, the exhaustion hitting me all at once. My paw throbbed, the pain sharp and searing. I looked down and saw it, the silver caltrip. It was still embedded in my flesh, burning, smoking, if only in my mind. I hadn't even remembered it was there. You've run far enough, Sarah said, her voice calm and soothing. She knelt beside me, her hands steady as they reached for my paw. You can rest now. The other wolves emerged from the shadows. Their forms were human, but their eyes gleamed with the same golden light. I could see it now with my wolf eyes. They surrounded me, silent and watchful, their presence both comforting and suffocating. There were so many. The players were doomed. Sarah's fingers brushed against my paw, and I winced, a low whine escaping my throat. She worked quickly, her movements precise and deliberate. The caltrip slid free, and I let out a ragged breath as the burning pain faded. There, she said softly. It's done. You're safe. I wanted to say something, to ask her why, how, what this all meant, but the words wouldn't come. My vision blurred, the exhaustion pulling at me like a weight I couldn't fight anymore. It's okay, Sarah said, her voice the last thing I heard before the darkness claimed me. Sleep. And I did. Chapter 87 Hot Kipling, Monster Hunter Back home, monsters were simple. Ancient witches, sorcerers, and priests defeated beasts of unfathomable power using magic they didn't understand. The magic was mostly lost to time, but the monsters were not really. These creatures had their own ironic form of immortality. As the great beasts were scavenged and broken down, their genetic code worked its way through the food cycle. The insects got their meal, then the birds, that sort of thing. Every living thing feeds off something else, passing this invasive genetic material along. It eventually makes its way into humans or other animals, occasionally latching on and binding itself to human DNA, creating a ticking time bomb. This process began eons ago. That's the theory, at least. Vampires, werewolves, heck, even those putrid ghouls called zombies could all be explained by this phenomenon. There was a good chance that I myself was walking around with some combination of ancient genetic code that might one day result in a mutation in my descendants, growing fangs or claws, being able to see in the dark, breathing underwater, or even lusting for blood. It was all in our DNA. My people were an interesting bunch. Our shadows had monsters in them. As time went on, the emergence of these phenomena slowed, and my world forgot about them. They became legends. Vampires. Those are just scary stories. Werewolves. It must have just been a bear. If you tried to discuss any of this in your thesis at university, your advisor would threaten to drop you. I would know. But if you were one of the unfortunate souls who discovered these weren't legends, that these monsters still crawled on the dirt, I was the type of person you wanted to know. I've killed them all, hunted them down. Vampires, werewolves, hags, all sorts of undead. I've tracked and studied pretty much everything there is to study. In fact, there's only one thing I've hunted that I didn't manage to kill. I tracked it all the way to Carousel. Once I've killed my ultimate prey, then I can die for real. The werewolves of Straight Dawn were a popular breed in Carousel stories. They were smart enough, theoretically, to take part in even complex plots. Most of the time, the werewolf virus in my world resulted in degenerative mental function. They were good at killing, but after a while, they stopped being good at anything else. Carousel didn't like that, so they were rarely used. But these Straight Dawn wolves, they were practically humans with superpowers. After a bit of practice, they could shift back and forth, even without the full moon. They could think, they could plan, assuming they had a pack leader who ordered them to. Fascinating creatures. Their mutation wasn't really a mutation at all. It was a curse. The magic of my homeworld worked differently and could never produce something like this. Unfortunately, I'd never been in a position to study this type of magic. I always got cast as a monster hunter, not a magic scholar. At least I could appreciate the exercise I get in this role. This was shaping up to be a good one. It was daytime. Antoine had shifted and run off into the woods, and I had a trap just for this situation, a perfect way of tracking him down, by following his blood trail, disturbances in the leaves, whatever was there. It was all I was permitted to do. I wasn't allowed to lead the players to victory, but that didn't mean I couldn't help out. The other Paragons and I had devoted our eternal lives to helping the players win the game, even if that meant playing demeaning roles or joining the likes of Silas Dearcon or the proprietor just to keep an eye on them. Because the players were the key, it had to be them to beat Carousel. I leaned against one of the stone walls in the fort, watching as hundreds of gallons of nitric acid were hauled into the courtyard in plastic jugs. Nitric acid, distilled water, copper scrap, and all the silver from every pawn shop within a 100-mile radius, it seemed. Other players had discovered rolling silver before, but none had taken the next step and realized that it was the act of purifying silver that hurt the wolves. Many assumed it was silver vapor, and that was a pretty good tactic, too, but purification won the blue ribbon. Here I was, thinking Andrews must be the smartest player to ever run Straight On. He certainly figured out the science part of it pretty quickly, but it turned out it was all the film buff's idea. Riley Lawrence. He wasn't much to look at. And yet, he was our best shot to beat the game, if we even had a shot. He may not have been the man for the job, but he was the man with the job. What qualified him for this honor? Hell, if I knew. With fewer than a dozen players left, they had to pick someone to hang their hopes on. As I saw him excitedly help sort supplies and bring in a load of empty glass bottles from a nearby soda factory, wearing that dumb smile on his face, I had to wonder how much he even knew. The kid was still wearing the suit from when he arrived at the dinner party. He had proper clothing to change into, but he liked his luggage tag so much that he would rather look like a fool. Why did that bother me so much? They were making bombs, or something similar, that could purify silver chemically. I knew how powerful rolling silver was against these cursed werewolves. Carousel was going to love it. The werewolf curse wasn't a vague hand-wavy magic concept. Instead, it was literally in the air like radio waves, connecting them to the pack, to their pack leader, and maybe even further than that. I had no idea. No one had ever gotten that far. I wondered how much Riley and Andrew understood. Purifying silver drew the curse out of the air and temporarily disconnected the wolf from the magic source that allowed it to exist. Without the magic of the curse, the werewolf's anatomy was not compatible with life, or at least, a comfortable life. Yep. If they could use that weapon well, they might just win. But they likely wouldn't. They were outgunned. I'd seen so many player wipes that I could almost call it before first blood. Unfortunately, despite being a fine planner, Riley Lawrence had one major flaw: he was a sacrificial character. He must have already known this, but I could see it plain as day on the red wallpaper. He was next on the list. He would die for second blood. That was his lot. That was his role. Damn shame. It didn't matter how good of a weapon he and Andrew were building. If he was next on the list, he was going to die, and no matter what he hid behind, the wolves would get through it, because the script said they must. From what I'd seen, he already knew this. He was likely prepared to sacrifice himself to ensure the survival of the group. I heard he'd done that before. We just had to hope they could get through the finale without his quick thinking. Who knew? They finally finished unloading the supplies and were meeting up for a group talk. The surviving players were Kimberly, a fine actress; Michael, a great fighter who was unwilling to take initiative; Andrew, a brilliant mind but a poor healer and not exactly one to endear himself to the audience; and Riley, the only one of them who seemed excited about what was going to happen, even if he tried to hide it. I walked closer. I had to stay in character, but maybe I could find some way of nudging them in the right direction nonetheless. "There's going to be a big fight," Riley said. "I don't know how many werewolves there are, but I expect Second Blood is going to save Cursed a lot of money on mercenaries. Unless he paid up front. We just have to find a way to control it, to make sure that we don't lose our strongest pieces on the board." They quieted their voices so the nearby NPCs couldn't hear. How cute. "When you say strongest pieces, are you referring to yourself?" Andrew asked, not angry but amused. "No," Riley said. "Right now, we have Kimberly because her plot is gaining a lot of momentum. And we also have Rolling Silver, and we've devoted so much time to that, it's got to have a big impact. I'd hate to waste it on Second Blood." I couldn't help but flash a grin. He was right. You only got one shot with a weapon like that. If you repeated yourself, you'd find that it just wouldn't work as well. It would be boring to the audience. You had to build up steam with something like this, and as soon as you let it out, it was gone. For maximum impact, this trap had to be saved for the finale. As a monster hunter, finding the secret weakness was literally 60% of what I did, and you had to be careful when you unveiled it. "So, what are your suggestions?" Andrew asked. Riley started to speak, but then he looked up at me, as if questioning whether he should talk about this in front of me. Fuck it, I thought. I winked at him. Made his day. He continued to speak, now a little more confidently. "We need to set up a sacrifice," he said. "We need to lose this round so that we can win the final battle, and we need to do it without using rolling silver, or whatever we're calling this chemical concoction. Splashing silver. Dissolving silver. Maybe." Andrew looked around at the supplies they had gathered. "How are we supposed to decide?" Andrew asked. "Aren't we just going to get attacked no matter what? Speaking of that, what is the narrative explanation for why the werewolves would attack us directly instead of just running away?" Important questions to ask. "Her," Riley said, nodding toward Kimberly. "Without her, we would have to go find them. But I'm pretty sure the pack wants Kimberly, so we can trust that they will attack us eventually." I'm light on the exact details. For second blood, though, we need to keep the fight away from the fort." They looked at each other, having their silent conversations. "That still leaves the question of how," Andrew said. "Well, look at my plot armor," Riley said. "We know where they're striking next." "I see," Andrew said. "That's the plan," Riley said. "That means you have to stick around, execute both the rolling silver plan, and ensure that Kimberly's whole subplot comes to fruition." So, he did understand his role. "I'll go with you," Michael said. "I fucked everything up so far. I missed my subplot, and I didn't manage to catch the wolf. Wherever you were going for second blood, I'll go too." Riley shook his head. "We don't need to lose 2 players, he said. "That would defeat the whole purpose of my sacrifice." "Then I'll go instead of you," Michael said. Logan said it was possible. "That was a special circumstance," Andrew said. "Riley has low effective plot armor. He's going to be targeted next." "Well, not necessarily," Riley said. "Wait a second. Had he figured it out?" "Technically, Michael could set off second blood by himself," Riley said. "How?" Andrew asked. "He could do something really, really stupid," Riley answered, barely suppressing a grin. "He could fall for a trap." This was fun. "Force Carousel's hand?" Andrew asked. "I'm not saying he has to do this or that it's even a smart thing," Riley said. "But hypothetically, if he did want to take my place, Hawk is about to take some mercenaries out and follow that blood trail with Antoine. But it's obviously a trap. It's too early to work." This was getting interesting. "How much did he know?" "How do you know it's a trap?" Kimberly asked. "There's a big reveal that has to happen. You know how it turned out that Antoine was the werewolf?" "Well, that doesn't really make sense because we already established that the little needle of werewolf saliva couldn't possibly have caused him to shift so soon," Riley said. "So I think I know what happened." Instead of going on, he waited for one of them to ask. "What happened?" Kimberly asked. A rant ensued. "We misunderstood how the werewolf trap works. We knew that any of us could be the werewolf, and we wouldn't know until the reveal, but we assumed that meant the werewolf would be a player until they were revealed. But what if it didn't mean that? What if Antoine counted as infected and therefore counted as an enemy the entire time? If he were an enemy, then the normal rules of targeting and priority wouldn't apply anymore. So, even if Lila had to be first blood, that didn't mean Antoine couldn't get attacked by another werewolf beforehand. Think about it. These werewolves are smart. If that blonde mercenary is a werewolf, as we think he is, I bet what he did was attack Antoine to help speed up the transformation. You know, he hit his heart. That's the only explanation for how Antoine could have turned so fast. I got footage of Antoine on his little patrol duty. He kept going off-screen and getting distracted looking into the distance. Not quite disassociating, not on-screen, not that my dailies trap would tell me, at least. I bet the blonde merc did him in on patrol, making him shift sooner than he would have. I think that's the next big reveal because we still have to reveal that the blonde mercenary is a werewolf. It all fits together. It seemed he even stumped Andrew for a moment with that one. Maybe he wasn't half bad as a player. Riley continued, second blood is a perfect time for that reveal. So if we sent Michael and a bunch of mercenaries out with the blonde mercenary to track down Antoine, I bet it's a mistake that could be avoided. Deliberately falling into a trap is one way to manipulate targeting orders since Carousel will punish you for that, and that will change the priority for an attack. The others looked at each other and then at me as if I could comment. Michael looked ready to go for it. I'll take out as many as I can, he said. But we don't have to do that, Riley said. It might be useful to have a fighter around for the finale without Antoine here. I looked at the shaggy-haired young man before me. The truth was that this team was underleveled and outmatched. Unfortunately, that was the way you had to play the game. It was the only way to ever escape. I looked around at the supplies they had gathered for their secret weapon against the wolves. Riley and Andrew had turned the story into a battle of wits. That was exactly what they needed to do with their meager muscle reserves. A battle of brawn was not going to be won by the players. It never was. These werewolves were fine specimens. Even if and one hadn't been turned, fighting these wolves in a straight-up deathmatch was folly. No, what they needed to survive was to keep their planner around a little longer. He might actually have known what he was doing. As always, I couldn't win this storyline for them, but I could help. I cleared my throat. I can track him wherever he went. If we are going on an expedition, if we are going on a hunt, I will lead it. And I might need a strong fighting man at my side, I said, looking at Michael. We should let you three stay here and work on your plans while the real men go get the job done. To be clear, I had 3 PhDs, but the storyline demanded I be a testosterone-filled mega man dumb enough to follow a werewolf back to its pack without scouting things out first. When we were back on screen, I would play my part. They looked at me like I might be some sort of demon. They didn't trust paragons. I couldn't blame them. So that must be the right decision, Kimberly said. If the paragon's going along with it. Maybe, Riley said. We don't know that, he added, hesitant. I wasn't going to risk saying any more. I walked forward and clapped Michael on the back. If he was willing to be the second blood sacrifice, then it was probably the right call. I'd deliver him like a present at the winter solstice. Straight On was a werewolf story, and there were dozens of variations that called for a monster hunter paragon. I had played this story hundreds of times. I had never seen its deep secrets, and I had never seen someone go this far with the rolling silver subplot. For a long time, players would just try to hook up with Serena, or Sarah, whatever she was calling herself nowadays. I used to get so annoyed. And here we were, possibly at the end, the real end, and it all came down to this little story on the outskirts of Carousel. One last hunt. One last group of players. And if they didn't succeed, we were doomed. I might never survive to hunt again. I might never find the beast I tracked all the way to this godforsaken world. I had died thousands of times, and this might end up being the only one that mattered. If I could help them win, I would do it. Chapter 88 Michael You sure you're up for this? Riley asked. Was he talking down to me? Why wouldn't he be? Everyone was doing that nowadays. Maybe they were patronizing. Maybe they were empathizing. All the same to me. I know what to do, I said firmly. I should never have told them that I dropped my subplot. Riley explained it away. He said that because any one of us had the chance to be the main character in the story, our subplots were larger than usual, so they needed more time devoted to them. Normally, I would have had plenty of room to put off following my character's plot, but not in the storyline. I didn't want to hear that. Maybe somebody else would want to hear how nothing is ever their fault, but not me. I should have known. It was on me. Everybody joined in with him and cooed at me like I was a baby, telling me that they had things taken care of, telling me that being a blood sacrifice was as important as anything that could have happened in my subplot. Yeah, right. I've never worked that way. I want somebody who tells me when I mess up and who holds me to the highest standard. Logan always did that. He would never let me settle for anything less than my best. Kimberly, Riley, Andrew, they didn't get it, but Logan did. If a man can't take responsibility for when he messes up, then he is no kind of man. Remember, Andrew said, you have to be the one to argue back against us. We'll tell you how bad of an idea it is to run into the woods after Int 1, and you have to fire back about how urgent things are. You have to be confident, too. I nodded and looked at Hawk Kipling out of the corner of my eye. He looked right back. He couldn't be the one to argue because he hit too high of a savvy stat. I never really understood how stats worked. It wasn't that no one had told me. I could explain it backward and forward. Adeline had forced me to memorize every part of it, but still, you're telling me that because some character has a high savvy stat, you need him to be quiet. Because if the dumb, suicidal idea is a smart person's idea, suddenly it won't be dumb and suicidal. They needed someone who didn't have high savvy to be the one calling the shots when we fell into this trap. They talked like it was obvious. That was the system. That was the game, don't you know that? They thought that if they could understand the system, they could find a path to victory. I still felt they were too trusting. As long as you think there are rules and that the rules matter, you'll be willing to give up your edge. You will walk to your death as long as you think the enemy will stick to the rules. That was something that Isaac understood, even though he always tried to put it in a joke. I couldn't help but feel that this was all one big mousetrap, and we were slowly being convinced to put our necks right over the line. Not just this storyline, but everything. And I would have to go along with it, too, because what other option did we have? I was the blood sacrifice. I had to keep the nerd alive. It all fell to me. On screen. You were going into those woods unprepared, Riley said. Why have we been planning this entire campaign if you're just going to charge off without a thought? He was following Hawk and me as we headed into the woods where most of the mercenaries waited for us. This is how you kill werewolves, I said, turning back to him, defiant. You track them, you find whatever cave or abandoned shack they're holed up in, and then you shoot them. My people have been doing this for centuries. You don't even know how many of them there are, Andrew interjected. None of our scouts have even been able to find the pack. I almost laughed. I was arrogant. I was self-assured. That was my character now. I have never known a werewolf pack to grow past a dozen wolves, I said. Have any of you? My people have been taking care of these lands and keeping them safe. If there were dozens of wolves in the woods, we would know about it. We stood at the edge of the forest, our argument so loud that the birds were fleeing from the trees. The trail is growing cold, I said. If we catch these wolves, we want to catch them when the sun is up. That's when we have the advantage. The immature wolves will be sitting ducks. The mature ones will be by themselves. We are burning daylight. You've got nearly 24 guys already in the woods, ready to go. If we lose the trail, we'll be back here to do it your way. But if we find them, we're going to end this before it gets ugly. I nodded to Hawk Kipling, and we walked into the forest to join the group of mercenaries waiting for us. I could hear Riley behind me as I stopped being on screen, and they continued to be. He explained that if they just waited till nightfall, their little rolling silver trick could be used to suss out any werewolf in our group. Of course, we couldn't do that because we needed the reveal to be timed for second blood. That was the most I had spoken in the entire storyline so far, but somebody had to do it. I didn't know how good my performance was, but if the goal was to make myself look dumb, I had probably succeeded. Riley said that there was a chance they would still be attacked and that Hawk and I would go unscathed for second blood. If things went that way, it might just come down to me and whoever survived the attack at the fort. As much as I hated to admit it, I hoped that would be the case. I had to rescue Logan and Avery, and being nothing but a blood sacrifice felt so small and insignificant. It all came down to whether the film buff actually understood the so-called system. If he was wrong, it would all come down to me, and I would not fail. But if he was right, and it was my time to go, I was going down swinging. The mercenaries clearly had training from somewhere, but they weren't using it. At times, they would cluster up too close together and fall out of formation when we went on screen. Carousel needed its good shot, and that meant we couldn't be stealthy, not really. Still, I tried. I directed them to spread out, not too thin, but to work our way through the brush quietly and methodically. There was a way to move through a forest to minimize your chances of being spotted and to maximize your chances of finding what you were looking for. Despite what Carousel had cast me as, I wasn't some Indian tracker or whatever nonsense you see in the movies. But I was a soldier, and I had common sense. And when Ant 1 had fled into the forest, he had been bleeding all over the place from a wound that would never heal because it was kept open by a silver caltrip. Somehow, Hawk had figured out that Ant 1 was the werewolf before anyone else. Even though he didn't tell me what we were doing, I figured it out pretty quickly. We needed to set up traps around the manor property while Ant 1 was gone so he wouldn't know where they were. Pretty clever. I caught on pretty quickly, too. It turned out that the film buff did as well, but his reasoning was something else. I kept hearing twigs snapping in the distance. I would signal for everyone to stop so I could listen, and they would obey. Carousel must have been angling for a very particular shot because it kept doing that. When it had gotten its shot of me taking command of the mercenaries, finally, the twig snapping stopped. I didn't show it, but I was downright spooked. Was it trying to get to me? I knew what was coming. There was no avoiding it. And if I tried to avoid it, it would be worse for everyone. But I was going to do my best. I lost the trail twice, but Hawk had a trap for tracking monsters, and he never managed to lose it. He would point me toward it with his eyes when we were on screen, almost like he wanted me to get the credit, because I needed charity. We walked forward, and those damn mercenaries kept bunching up again. This wasn't just them going against their training, something was happening. I could see it in the way the monster hunter Paragon kept looking at them like he knew what was going on. How much of the script could Paragon see? The wolves were about to attack. Second blood was upon us, and the needle on the plot cycle confirmed it for me. Riley was right. He found a way to survive even with his pathetic plot armor. Hats off to him. I expected a roar. I expected screams. But what I heard instead was a loud bang. I looked behind me. All the mercenaries had been bunched up because, as it turns out, the wolves weren't attacking in wolf form. No. Someone had just let off a grenade. A flashbang, from the sound, but that couldn't have been it. Body parts were flying. Movies never get ordnance right. I started screaming commands into the air, instincts at this point, but my words were falling on deaf ears. I couldn't even hear them coming out of my own mouth. All I heard was a bright, piercing sound in my ear that seemed to grow like a balloon filling up until my head wanted to explode. And then there was nothing. No sound could get near me. I was nearly deaf at times. The sound was coming in and out. I dropped back into the woods, into the thick brush away from the clearing where the mercenaries had just been torn apart. I looked for my target, and it didn't take long to find him. The others were right, it was the blonde mercenary. He stood there, not as a wolf, but as a man with a gun. He had been far away from the others. Then he pulled out his sidearm and started leveling it at the screaming mercenaries, silencing them one shot at a time with a devilish smile on his face, like he'd tricked us. And I had to play along because I drew the short straw. Hell, I'd volunteered for the short straw. And I always would. But I was gonna kill that damn wolf. I leveled my rifle at him, but before I could fire, I finally saw a flash of fur. But it wasn't from him. There was another wolf, a big one with long arms. I screamed loudly and stupidly because I wasn't supposed to believe they'd come out in the daylight like this. That was only mature wolves, 1 in 1,000, right? But here they were, no less than a dozen. No less than 2 dozen. 3 dozen. They were pulling in from all sides. I was going to die. And as the numbers increased, I realized the other players would, too. How had we never talked about numbers when it came to the wolf pack? Why had we just assumed it would be 12? Where did we even get that number from? A book? Some random lore insight? Important questions asked too late. I grabbed my sight piece and dropped the wolf that had thrashed my rifle. He didn't even get a scratch on me. Another shot into another wolf. And it continued like that. Most of the mercenaries were shredded, but one of them, whose name I had never learned, actually managed to kill a werewolf. It was almost funny. These NPCs were tough, they were supposed to be, but in this slaughter, they were torn apart like toilet paper. Except for that one NPC with a big mustache, gunning down wolves left and right. Had he even had speaking parts? I couldn't remember. Still, I couldn't hear much. But I was on a swivel, gun in each hand, waiting for the wolves to charge, to get close. They dropped like clay pigeons. I heard Hawk yelling, asking how there could be so many wolves during daylight hours. Couldn't understand him exactly. He sounded like he was in disbelief, like the possibility that he misunderstood the enemy was non-existent. And yet, here we were. He was playing dumb, and I was playing dumber. Where was that blonde mercenary? Had he already shifted? I shot wolf after wolf, and they all fell. I knew how to make a fight look good. I dropped to the ground and crawled. When a wolf came on top of me, I shot up, got it through the roof of the mouth, then another into the heart. These wolves could only be defeated in the zenith of battle during a climactic moment. That meant Carousel saw my death as a climactic moment. I wondered if Riley had understood that. The way he explained it, it sounded like the wolves had to be killed in a climactic way. But as I mowed down these sick dogs, I realized there was more than one way to make a climactic moment. Not just with some science experiment or a trap, but by giving it all. One wolf down, then another. I called out Hawk's name, but I couldn't say if he responded. I jumped into the underbrush and climbed through to the other side of the vegetation, and there he was, getting hollowed out by a wolf with unusually light fur. I double-barreled into it, but I was too late. I didn't even see what it was that got me. I was out before the pain even came. But that was pretty normal with my grit. The lights went out, and all I focused on was continuing to pull the triggers on my guns like some die-hard chicken with its head cut off. I'd like to think I killed another wolf in those final moments, but I knew I couldn't get the one. Not the one I wanted. Everything went dark, and I wondered if it would be the last time. Tope continued. Thanks for listening.